Going live. You're live. Okay. We're recording now. I'm just going to give it a second for people to log in and watch. And people will be joining us and sending questions as we begin.
And if for some reason I lose the connection, I'm going to use the Zoom link again to come back.
Okay. We're recording now. I'm just going to give it a second. There. I'm going to turn off the back feed. Great. So we've got some people watching. Let's start and go ahead with it. So welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. My name's Diego Cupolo. I'm the managing editor of Turkey Recap. I'm here with Berk Esen, Sabanci University political science assistant professor. We originally met in Ankara, but I took a special liking to Berk because he also spent time in Argentina as myself. So I appreciate his different perspectives on Turkish politics particularly. And we're all here because, as you know, Turkey has presidential and parliamentary elections coming on May 14th. They could be one of the most consequential elections that Turkey's seen in its modern history. And what we're being presented is basically a choice between two governing structures, with Erdogan offering more of what we've seen in the last few years, which is a highly personalized, highly centralized executive presidency. And the main opposition candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, is calling for a return to a parliamentary system with greater separation of powers and strengthened institutions. So the outcome of this will be significant for domestic politics, to put it briefly, and it will also have impacts on foreign relations for years to come. And to help us understand where we are now, we're going to talk to Berk Esen, just to talk about the structure of this YouTube live stream. We're going to be talking between 1 hour and 1 hour and a half. If you have questions, we're glad to take them. Please send them via YouTube on the chat column, or just DM Turkey Recap at Turkey Recap on Twitter. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and I'll definitely group them. And also, I have to mention that Turkey Recap is a reader-supported newsletter. We are completely independent. Basically, no single donor gives us more than $20 a month, and we're not associated with any political parties or NGOs. It's a journalist-run newsletter and news platform. So we're glad to be putting on these kinds of things and deeply appreciate the support we get from our patrons and Substack supporters and the rest, where you make this possible. So, Berk, many questions that I got over the weekend were mostly about Kılıçdaroğlu and his prospects for victory. So polls say he wasn't the most popular opposition candidate. So what do you have to say about this, his prospects, and how does running with İmamoğlu and Yavaş as vice presidents impact his appeal for voters?
No, it certainly is the case that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has not necessarily been the most popular politician within the opposition camp. Of course, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the current leader of the main opposition party, CHP, the Republican People's Party, he's not a new name in the political arena. He's been leading CHP since May 2010. He's a fairly old politician, 74 years old, and of course, is not necessarily known to be a very energetic campaigner. So that's why many people within the opposition ranks were really very worried at the prospect of Kılıçdaroğlu becoming the joint candidate for the opposition alliance. But of course, that's exactly what happened. I think his chances are, I mean, obviously this is going to be a tough election, regardless of who runs against Tayyip Erdogan. But I think over the last 6 months or so, maybe over the last a year or so, I should probably say, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has been emboldened by the fact that there is an ongoing economic crisis, which is really eating into the base of the AKP. And the fact that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, as the leader of the main opposition party, could establish, what seems to be a fairly diverse opposition coalition, despite some internal rifts, managed to really keep it intact. I think sort of increased his chances and certainly increased the level of support among opposition voters for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. And then, of course, recently, this devastating earthquake has, I think, really persuaded him that he can really win. That, in fact, almost anyone that is supported by the opposition alliance will be able to win. I think that's the reason why he's been pushing so hard for his own candidacy, even though, for instance, in the 2014 and 2018 presidential elections, he decided not to run himself and instead nominated other politicians. So that's I think the situation with regards to the Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu candidacy. But I think the fact that particularly Meral Akşener, the leader of İyi Party, pushed for these two popular mayors, the current mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, and the current mayor of Ankara, Mansur Yavaş, to join Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu on the campaign trail, almost like an American-style presidential ticket system. Of course, we don't necessarily have it in a formal capacity, but at least the opposition alliance announced that these two popular mayors will become candidates for the vice presidency. I think certainly boosted Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's prospects. Because unlike Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, these two mayors are quite popular, and even more beneficial for the opposition. They actually speak to different constituencies, in Turkey. Ekrem İmamoğlu certainly is well liked among both Turkish but also Kurdish voters. He comes from a Black Sea family, and so certainly has a base there. He's been seen to be a very successful and competent mayor of Istanbul, so certainly has a strong base there. Now, just juxtaposed to that, Mansur Yavaş hails from a Turkish nationalist background. He's been running Ankara since March of 2019, so he's really well liked among nationalist voters, which is going to be a problem. Which is going to be a really problematic base for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. So when you add both into this presidential ticket equation, I think it certainly is going to boost Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's prospects. There is, however, one major question that needs to be settled, and to me, it's not yet really clear. I think the results of the election, and particularly how much of an electoral impact these two mayors are going to have, will come down to how effectively Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is going to use both mayors in his campaign. Are they going to be touring the country with him? Are they going to do separate events? Are they going to join Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu in large rallies? Will there be enough of an assurances to the voters that these two mayors will immediately become vice president as soon as Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is elected? Will that message be credible? Those issues are still a bit up in the air, because according to an agreement forged by the Table of Six, these two mayors, if Kılıçdaroğlu is elected, will become vice president, but at the time of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's choosing, and with the portfolio that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu picks for them. Now, those are still fairly loose issues, and I think we're going to learn more about the content of this deal as we head into this campaign. And my sense is that if the polls remain to be rather tight, and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's prospects are not very high, then we're going to see both mayors more effectively, more visibly, and then probably the political windfall for these two mayors will be a lot higher. If Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, however, seems to be doing an okay job on the campaign trail, probably people around him will try to push out these two popular mayors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot is unresolved and undefined, and we'll have to see how it goes. In one of our previous talks, you mentioned that the earthquake gave Erdogan a new platform to campaign on. And we have a lot of questions about the earthquake and how it's going to impact elections. So how do you think the main candidates, there are other candidates I should mention, but we're mainly going to talk about Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdogan until a bit later. So how do you think the main candidates might address the damage and the reconstruction related to the earthquake in their campaigns and possibly after elections?
Well, I think we can imagine what Erdogan will run on the campaign trail. He's going to say, and as he has already said over the last month or so, that this was the biggest disaster of century that Turkey had faced since the proclamation of the Republic, and that no government could have really done anything about it, given the sheer magnitude of the earthquake. In fact, a set of earthquakes had hit Turkey in early February, but that despite the high magnitude of these earthquakes, the disaster relief efforts are underway, and that the government, even though they have sort of wavered and failed a bit during the first few days, since then, the government has been doing a pretty good job, and Erdogan is going to promise, as he has already done so, to rebuild the earthquake damaged areas within 1 year. So the government is already in the process of creating large public tenders to construct tens of thousands of new apartment buildings in the area. And then, he's going to say that given the sheer scale of this disaster, Turkey needs a strong leader, a strong government, and that Erdogan, as a tested leader, has already addressed similar issues over the last 20 years. And so voters should not really take a chance and support him. I think that's going to, and of course, he'll probably try to shift the blame a bit, because it's very clear that even among AKP voters, there's certainly anger at the incompetence of some of the government's measures and the fact that so many buildings collapse. So we may probably see a prosecution of some contractors whose buildings were demolished after the earthquake, right? So Erdogan may even force some of the civil servants to resign because of their incompetent rule after the earthquake. But so strong promises, strong, concrete, tangible promises, as well as probably shifting the blame using the media. I think the government is going to really run this targeted message. That we know. Of course, it's not really clear how convincing this discourse will be. I mean, we know that the opposition voters are already quite pissed off at the government, and that's not going to change regardless of what Erdogan says. So as far as Erdogan is concerned, I think the goal would be to persuade the government base, and that's basically all he needs. Now, for the opposition, it will be quite the opposite. I mean, obviously, opposition politicians, particularly the candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, has been very critical of the government's incompetent management of both the relief efforts and the post-earthquake situation. So the opposition politicians will probably focus on good governance. In other words, they're going to say the presidential system, this one-man rule, is really the real reason why the earthquake hit Turkey so drastically. They're going to suggest that because of the fact that Erdogan has been working with incompetent officials, the sheer scale of the disaster has been enlarged. And of course, the opposition is going to promise a clean administration with no corruption, with more competent officials, and a return to parliamentary system. Of course, these are all good promises, but they're not tangible. And I think the opposition needs to do a bit more in order to convince voters who are still living in the earthquake damaged area, probably people who have lost their houses and they really need quick fixes. A parliamentary system, no corruption, competent administration, good governance. These are all very good promises, especially in a democratic context. But considering the sheer scale of the disaster, I think the opposition needs to do a bit more. And my sense is that this is where the two popular mayors come in. Because, Mansur Yavaş and Ekrem İmamoğlu, they're well liked, they're well respected. There seem to be competent politicians, competent mayors, even by some government voters, even by some AKP supporters. So if they can really campaign on the ground, sort of meet with voters, give them promises, the Ankara and Istanbul municipality governments have already been on the ground since the earthquake, sort of distributing, distributing resources, trying to build the infrastructure of the zone. If we see them more on the ground together with Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, then that might sort of compensate for the lack of tangible promises that has been delivered by Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu so far, and that the two mayors can really make a huge difference, especially in the earthquake zone, because Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu doesn't really have that image. He doesn't really have the image of a strong administrator, a competent politician who can really get the job done. In fact, this has been his, I would say, his main weakness over the years. But İmamoğlu and Yavaş do. So this should be, I think, the opposition strategy as we go on to the campaign stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good points. And yeah, it makes me think about many of these sokak röportajlar where the people say that they don't want to vote for Kılıçdaroğlu because he hasn't won and lacks charisma. But I mean, if he did win, it'd be a different situation. So I find that, yeah, the logic is strange to follow sometimes in voter preferences, but the charisma is definitely a factor that paves over any doubts, let's say. And all good points that you raised. We also have a lot of people asking about Akşener and her weekend dispute over Kılıçdaroğlu's candidacy. Obviously that passed, and we have the vice presidents as a result running with Kılıçdaroğlu. But I wanted to ask about what this means for the Iyi Party and Iyi Party voters, because there's many disillusioned Iyi Party voters who don't necessarily back Erdogan or Kılıçdaroğlu, and this is a significant percentage of the Turkish electorate. So where will Iyi Party voters go during these elections, if you can make any predictions? And what is Akşener's political future after that stunt? Both of them seem to be big question marks.
Well, this is a very good question, and I don't know if the answer is clear at this point. I think it's going to partly come down to the campaign performance of the candidate, the main candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, as well as Meral Akşener. She's been, many of us have been wondering why Meral Akşener. I was expecting some kind of a crisis to break out, between these opposition leaders at the table of six, but I was taken back by the viciousness of Meral Akşener's speech on Friday, on March 4th. But since she returned back to the negotiation table and basically at least could get the two popular mayors into the presidential ticket, she's been in damage control. She's been openly supporting Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. She's going to run as a VP candidate. She has sort of endorsed the opposition alliance. So I think she managed to win back some of the disillusioned voters who've been sort of surprised by her strong response to Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. However, the jury is still out on those voters who are disillusioned by the fact that she returned to the table of six, because I think Iyi Party voters, this is not a monolithic base. You basically have anything and everything between Turkish secular ultranationalists who have hardline positions, not only in their opposition against Erdogan, but also vis-a-vis the Kurdish question, right? So there is no one cleavage that separates Turkish voters, that is anti-Erdogan voters, pro-Erdogan voters. I think when it comes to especially Iyi Party voters, you also have a second cleavage, which is Kurdish nationalism, Turkish nationalism. So the Iyi Party base is really a very diverse one, ranging from the secular ultranationalists to sort of secular center-right voters who fall somewhere between CHP and Iyi Party. So the latter group was really disappointed by the fact that Akşener caused trouble and really risked disintegrating the electoral alliance. However, the former group, the Turkish ultranationalists, are probably disillusioned by the fact that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is the eventual opposition joint candidate, and that he's talking with HDP, and Akşener has been humiliated, and many CHP voters have openly attacked Akşener and İyi Party. So she has to really walk a very delicate, tight sort of line, keeping both groups within the party. And so far, she's been doing that, right? So she's in damage control. She openly endorsed the ticket, but she's been sort of very visibly trying to distance herself, and sometimes physically distance herself from the other opposition leaders. For instance, she didn't participate to this large conference organized in Izmir over the weekend. All other 5 opposition leaders who are part of the Nation Alliance were there. Akşener was visibly absent. She was visibly absent on March 6th, at the dinner when the candidate was announced. So I think she's going to really follow this delicate strategy. During the campaign, I think she will try to drive home the point that she is really responsible for having Mansur Yavaş and Ekrem İmamoğlu on the ticket. And so whatever benefits their running will incur, she's going to hope that that support is going to come to İyi Party. And she's going to campaign on that. İyi Party has already printed posters in major cities sort of showing Meral Akşener's photo or picture together with these 2 other popular mayors. Now, I can only answer your question in terms of different scenarios. If Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu wins the presidency, then of course Meral Akşener is going to become vice president, and İyi Party is going to be the second biggest party that's in power. So she will certainly be an effective partner. And, when you have access to power, it's very difficult for you to lose the leadership of your party. However, if Kılıçdaroğlu loses, then, of course, it's really going to come down to the elected performance of İyi Party. If İyi Party performs better than it did in 2018 general elections, so in other words, if they get above 10%, which was really the limit of the party's base in 2018, then she can say, look, I warned, I tried to prevent Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu from becoming the candidate. I said repeatedly that he's probably not the candidate who can win. What can I do? I already, tried. And look, my party actually performed well. So she's going to probably use that to survive as a leader. But then, of course, then, if the opposition loses, that's going to be a very, very difficult sort of period, for these parties. And Akşener may retain her leadership, but her party may experience difficulty expanding its vote support because Erdogan will still be in power. So I think it really comes down to the scenarios, whichever one of these scenarios materialize.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So I would just like to clarify that the poster you talked about with Akşener and the 2 mayors, there's 2 sets of those, and there's one of her with Kılıçdaroğlu as well.
Yes.
Oftentimes they're together, sometimes they're not together, and if you only see the one of her with the mayors, it can look like something subversive. As we've seen on Twitter, some people are posting just the one of her with the mayors, asking who is running. And that's misleading because there are different versions. They're just not always together. Yes. I just wanted to highlight that. And we have to talk about HDP, the other big party in the opposition. And there's a lot going on there. Kılıçdaroğlu was meeting with the co-chairs today. They announced that basically Kılıçdaroğlu said that he would try to resolve the Kurdish problem and other democratic issues facing Kurdish population in Turkey and other minorities in parliament, which is along with the basically opposition rhetoric about resolving political problems in parliament. But this also elevates the issue to something that should be addressed in parliament, and you can talk about that. But I wanted to highlight also the fact that there's a closure case on HDP, and it seems like the earthquake has delayed this closure case. So we got some questions about the timeline, whether HDP might be closed before elections, and has this changed calculations for different parties or opposition blocks, Erdogan? And also, what do you think about the plan B of Yeşil Sol Party substituting for HDP? So these are a lot of questions about HDP, but before you answer, I'm just going to say I visited the HDP headquarters in Diyarbakir today. I'm in Diyarbakir as we speak. I'm here for Nowruz. I was picking up credentials, and I just wanted to highlight that the HDP headquarters seems to have moved locations in Diyarbakir because of this protest that's being allowed in front of the original HDP headquarters. There were many people camping out, staying there in tents many days of the week. I don't know if they were staying overnight, but they were there during the week and during the days. And basically, it became too difficult to operate, apparently, for the HDP, is what I understand. So they moved their headquarters to another location, another branch of their party. So that was something interesting to note. And I would also note that in this new location that they call their headquarters, the HDP, it's right up. You have HDP on one side of the hallway, and you have Yeşil Sol Party on the other side. So I would just comment that they remain separate parties for now. And we'll see where this goes after today's meeting with Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. So go ahead.
I mean, so this, this closure case against the HDP, this has been going on for quite some time. I think it's been more than a year now. And, to me, it's quite clear that Erdogan has been, or in general, the regime has been sort of delaying that process so that they have this, this weapon to be used at the last minute if necessary. Because, of course, the current political system in Turkey is quite authoritarian, and these kind of electoral authoritarian regimes, in other words, authoritarian regimes that still continue to hold elections regularly, they usually use, they politicize the judiciary, and then they use judiciary in a very partisan manner in order to weaken regime opponents. And I think one strategy that they used, and we've seen this in the closure case against HDP, or the political ban case against Kaftancıoğlu, or now Ekrem İmamoğlu, the goal of the regime is not necessarily to take a fully fledged autocratic steps, but rather to create uncertainty. And I think that uncertainty, does affect HDP, because the Constitutional Court delayed the date for the oral defense to April 11th, which is one day after the official MP candidate lists are to be, officiated. In other words, they're going to be submitted, and then no change can be done. If you are an HDP politician right now, you're not really sure if HDP will be closed, first of all, and then two, whether, if the party is going to be banned, whether or not that decision will be taken before or after the election. And it creates uncertainty, because then you cannot really operate, with full knowledge. And of course, that really constrains options of HDP, because, if they run the risk of being completely disallowed from entering the elections, then it may make sense for them to run their candidates under the banner of a different party, this party being Yeşil Sol Party, as you mentioned in your question. I think it's a risky but understandable move on the part of HDP, but comes with risks. Of course, the first risk being HDP has, it's a brand, it's a political brand that is well known across the country, and pretty much all HDP voters are very familiar about their party. Yeşil Sol Party is Of course, that party has been around for some time, but not everyone knows it. So there is a transaction cost to changing your party banner and contesting the election or deciding to contest the election 6 weeks before the election is held. But more importantly, and maybe we can have this discussion when we get to the discussion of election observation. According to Turkish electoral law, the top 5 parties are allowed to nominate an election observer at each ballot box. And of course, HDP, being the 3rd largest party in the country, officially gets to have that observer status across the country in each ballot box. However, if HDP decides not to contest the elections, but instead the Yeşil Sol Party goes in, then of course we're going to lose all of these election observers across the country. But I think it's going to be very decisive, especially in the southeastern provinces. So so there are some risks involved going with Yeşil Sol Party, but of course there are risks involved in contesting the elections under the banner of HDP. In terms of the closure case, I don't think that it's a clear-cut situation. Well, first of all, in the Constitutional Court, I don't know if Erdogan still has the numbers to close down HDP because there are still some judges who are appointed or who were appointed during Abdullah Gül's presidency, and maybe even 1 or 2 members who were nominated under Ahmet Necdet Sezer's presidency. Ahmet Necdet Sezer was president of Turkey from 2000 to 2007, Abdullah Gül from 2007 to 2014. So there is a chance that there might not be sufficient majority, because I think you need a comfortable majority, not just simple majority, but a comfortable majority. So first of all, it's not really clear cut. And of course, it's not really clear to me if 1 month, is a sufficient time to ban the party, because of course the oral defense is going to take a few days. Then an official report needs to be written, and then that report needs to be deliberated, discussed, and then the Constitutional Court takes a decision. Usually 1 month is a very, very tight deadline to go through that. But of course, having said this, this is an authoritarian regime, and I cannot really rule out the possibility. But if HDP is closed, that would, I think, indicate us that Erdogan is so desperate that he's willing to use the nuclear option, because once you ban HDP before an upcoming election, it's going to send a very strong signal, both to outside observers that Turkey is a very, very authoritarian place, and of course there'll be a backlash among Western governments, but also it sends a very strong message to the domestic voters that this is an authoritarian regime. Kurdish voters who might be sitting on the fence when it comes to picking between Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and Tayyip Erdogan. So for instance, think of Kurdish conservative voters who might be still a bit uneasy about Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, but also have their doubts against Tayyip Erdogan. They may be undecided. They may decide not to vote in the presidential elections. But if HDP is closed down, I think all of them will come back to support Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. So, if he does it, if he takes that decision and the party is banned, that will show us that Erdogan is really desperate, willing to use the nuclear option, which of course may bring some benefits to the regime, because in the parliamentary elections it may make things difficult. But in the presidential elections, I think it may backfire. Now, Erdogan, who knows, maybe he's negotiating with some HDP groups behind the scenes, threatening them with this closure case to maybe persuade them to run a separate candidate in the presidential elections. But I doubt that HDP would really, come to that agreement. So I think Erdogan is really running out of options when it comes to HDP.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll return to the point you raised on election observers later, regarding the election integrity and ballot box issues that we might foresee on election day. But before that, we're getting a good amount of questions on HDP, and some people are asking for more specific points to be highlighted, like how you think Kılıçdaroğlu will navigate the relationship with HDP in his campaign. It seems to be a touchy issue. HDP is often associated with the PKK, which is an outlawed terrorist organization. in Turkey and the US and the EU. So how do you think he'll navigate such a touchy topic? And also, will the promises that he makes to the party go beyond the rhetoric we saw today, or will it just remain a kind of rhetorical relationship? And then we also have someone bringing up the term kingmaker, which is always interesting in English. I don't know how I feel about it. I would say swing vote for Kurdish voters, but in many headlines, we see HDP and Kurdish voters being the kingmakers in Turkey. We've seen it many years in a row. When we have elections, it's a common used term. So usually a kingmaker should be able to make some conditions in exchange for their king making. If they're going to make you a king, you need to give them something, but I'm not sure we've seen that for the HDP. It seems like a decisive swing vote, but I'm not sure what they get in response for this support. What can you say about what Kılıçdaroğlu can and can't do during the campaign, and what maybe we can expect if he wins that he would be able to give to HDP supporters?
You know, these are really very important, and you know, these are very important, crucial questions. You know, let me start off with your last question. I don't think that Kılıçdaroğlu can really give a lot of tangible promises to HDP. You know, what he said today, you know, the country has become so authoritarian, and the government is you know, it has adopted such repressive policies against HDP that you know, even empty gestures you know, stand out. Basically, what Kılıçdaroğlu said today, which is that the parliament is really the place where he discussed these issues, and kayyum politics should end. These are the stuff that he's been saying for years, right? You know, for instance, during the solution process, that was exactly Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's position. He said, well, discuss this issue in the parliament. The parliament should be where we, you know, so it's nothing new for Kılıçdaroğlu. You know, he's been critical of kayyum policy of the government for some time now. This, of course, is a bit different from how nationalists have really approached this issue. But Kılıçdaroğlu, you know, for Kılıçdaroğlu, what he said today was nothing new. And of course, it's not really very tangible, and I don't think that it's really a huge advance, because 3 years ago there was no kayyums. So you know, in 2016 you could have HDP mayors run their municipality governments, and of course during the solution process, HDP was negotiating openly with the government. So they're not necessarily in a, you know, they're not necessarily going to be in a well-off sort of a position. Now, having said that, I think with regards to the kingmaker point, I think that's a very interesting point. But what I've seen over the years is that the moment HDP retained that status, and I think they did, for instance, in June, you know, after June 2015 elections, where HDP, you know, thanks to the political windfall or momentum that Selahattin Demirtas generated, HDP got more than 13 percentage points. Received, I think, 80 MPs in the parliament, and was really the kingmaker. And in fact, they've been very flexible in supporting an alternative coalition government. And yet the Turkish nationalists, then under MHP, did not really go along. And so in order to really prevent HDP from getting that kingmaker status, Turkish nationalists actually switched their support for AKP and pushed for an autocratization process. So I think that's the key point. If the country becomes more and more democratic, yes, HDP will become, you know, will retain that kingmaker status. But if the country becomes authoritarian, as it currently is, then the HDP's dilemma would be, well, should we go along with AKP MHP, who's going to give us almost nothing and will repress us? Should we go along with the other opposition coalition that is promising us normalcy, but no major concession on important issues? So if Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu wins, I think Demirtas will be out of prison. He should be out of prison. So, you know, it's not, you know, that's not a huge step. But of course, considering the fact that he's been in prison for the last 7 years, that of course will be a very positive step. Kayyum politics will be over. But beyond that, I think it's going to take a while before the parliament settles, the parliament can agree on a democratic solution of some sort, whatever the boundaries are. You can say the parliament is the solution, sure, but what will the parliament will decide on? At this point, except for and maybe some CHP MPs, almost the entire parliament will be opposed to making any kind of concrete concessions. So I think it's going to be a while before at the national level there could be major change. I think at the local level there could be a set of changes. As the country becomes more democratic, HDP mayors will serve their terms. Demirtas will be out. That may increase HDP's popular appeal, but then HDP will hit a ceiling. 13 points, 14 points, 15 points. But beyond that, democratic politics is always better, but I'm not necessarily expecting HDP will become the kingmaker and then everything will change dramatically.
Thanks for that. Yeah, just to clarify, the opposition in its joint text or memorandum said they would follow ECHR rulings, European Court of Human Rights rulings, which includes releasing Demirtas and Kavala. So that's part of their joint agreement, which I guess includes ActionNet, right?
Yes.
We have other questions on HCP and a bit more specific. Maybe you can answer these as much or as little as you want if you're capable. There's more than 450 HDP politicians facing a political ban. Does switching party change anything for them? I'm going to guess no, but you can detail that. And then another question, can HDP enter election with only one MP just to retain its right to appoint an election observer to every ballot box once in the parliament? That MP can switch to the Yeşil Sol party. So if they just run one MP and then they run just to keep the election observer at every ballot box, but if the party's banned, I'm guessing that would negate that option. Do you understand? Are you following me? Do you want me to repeat that?
Yes. Yeah. No, I've seen the questions. So, with regards to the 451 HDP politicians, like you mentioned, it's a no. If they are banned personally. So, even if they run under the banner of another party, they will still be disallowed from standing for office in the upcoming election. So I think it'll be very risky to nominate these politicians under the banner of Yeşil Sol Party, because then that party is going to lose a lot of candidates. With regards to the other question, I think that's a very important question. I don't know whether you need to run a certain number of candidates, whether there is like a minimum list of candidates to run. That certainly is something that I think HDP should consider, because the election observer status is really, really important, because of course HDP's strongholds are located in heavily Kurdish populated eastern and southeastern provinces. This is a region of Turkey where you basically have two main political actors, the ruling party, AKP, and then HDP. Well, since the ruling party may resort to some shady operations, you need HDP to have these observers, and CHP doesn't really have a very sizable organizational presence there. So that's the thing that worries me. Yes, so if there is no minimum number of candidates that HDP can run, they should certainly try to keep the party banner so that at least their observers can be appointed to every ballot box. I think these kind of creative strategies should definitely be used in the upcoming election.
Yeah. So moving on to some questions I got before today. A Western diplomat says many diplomats base their political analysis on polling data from Turkey and where things are heading. Main question is, how reliable is this polling data? Some recent polls have shown Kılıçdaroğlu 10 points ahead of Erdogan. What can you say about the validity of political forecasting that we're seeing? And does the data reflect reality? If there's hesitancy of freedom of expression. If if people feel they're going to be punished for not supporting the ruling party, can they really report who they're going to vote for openly? What can you say about polling outcomes and forecasting?
I don't think that freedom of expression has been a huge issue in these opinion polls so far, because over the years, even in the most recent 2019 local elections, at least some opinion polls turned out to be accurate. So I don't think that there is a systematic bias due to the fact that we have an authoritarian regime, and so some voters might be hesitant to demonstrate their political preferences, especially if they belong to the opposition camp. In this election cycle, there may be some shy voters, maybe some supporters of Muharrem Ince, maybe even some supporters of Tayyip Erdoğan, the so-called shy voters, in the sense that some voters may think that their own immediate circles would prefer them to choose another candidate. So there's a lot of societal pressure, but individually they may decide to go for another candidate. They may be too shy to admit that in front of their friends or among their friends. So there may be that effect, but I don't think that it's going to be huge. Now, I'm not a pollster, so I can't really talk about the reliability of polls in general. My sense is that some polling companies do a much better job than others, and that the problem here with some companies might be their measurement techniques. Again, this is not my main area, but it seems that it really comes down to, how these polling agencies weigh the undecided voters, how these undecided voters are distributed among the candidates or political parties, how polling is done, whether or not the sample that these polling agencies pick is really a representative one. So when they find inaccurate results, it may be because they don't do their job effectively. But I think with some polling companies, the problem is that they do business with certain political parties. They may have open political loyalties such that they are probably manipulating the results. I won't be able to tell you which company really works with which party, and I think it'll be beyond my expertise on my own personal knowledge. But looking at the distribution of the results, there is actually a high variation. You don't necessarily see that in other countries. Now, of course, the early polls indicated that, like you asked in your question, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is 10 points ahead of Erdoğan. I take it with a grain of salt. Well, first of all, to me, it doesn't sound very realistic that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu will be ahead of Tayyip Erdoğan by such a huge margin under such a short period. And also, these results have been announced almost 4 or 5 days after Kılıçdaroğlu's name was announced. I don't know if it's possible to really do an effective polling across the country in 4 or 5 days. So probably those results are a bit biased. So my strategy would be to pick a few companies that I consider to be reliable by looking at the previous predictions of these companies over the years, and then maybe take an average and maybe look at the overall trend, right? So if polling company A suggests that Kılıçdaroğlu is getting 44%, that doesn't mean that he's going to necessarily get 44%. But I think if we see a positive trend in favor of Kılıçdaroğlu or the other way around, that indicates something. So I try to both compare some of these results, but also look at them over time to see, if these companies are making some biases, some faulty calculations, at least they will be able to measure the trend. And that would give us an indication. But beyond that, well, first of all, this election, there are so many unknowns: the public disaster, earthquake situation, polling agencies, how effectively they will be able to get the polling in the earthquake damaged areas. There are many unknowns. It's difficult to really make a full prediction, but seeing the trends, I think that would say something. And so far, it seems to be on the optimistic side for Kılıçdaroğlu. But again, 10 points, I think it's too optimistic. it just doesn't seem very reliable.
Mhm. And we have 2 months to go, which means anything could happen, right?
Especially in Turkish politics.
You opened the Ince box. We're going to have to address Muharrem Ince and his dancing and his candidacy and his statements, which seem to waver often, daily. He's got a lot of mixed messages saying maybe he'll pull out or remain as a candidate. It seems unclear, but he does seem to have some supporters. I don't understand if they're real. I think they are, because personally, I saw some Ince graffiti, I think in February or January, earlier this year, in Sarıyer, Istanbul. And I stopped and took a picture of it because I said, what is this? Is this a statement? Is this real? Who's supporting Ince right now? But he's a force. The background is that he was a presidential candidate for the CHP and lost, and then famously just disappeared that night. Now he's back, and he's a figure. And the reason we have to talk about him is because in a tight race, small percentages can change outcomes. So how can Ince impact votes, and whose votes, AKP or CHP? What's his appeal? What is the deal with Ince?
Well, I'm really very ambivalent when it comes to Muharrem Ince, because on the one hand, you're very familiar with US politics as well as Argentine politics. And so I think Muharrem Ince has a populist mold, and populist politicians, they really catch fire, they energize their base, they can, expand their popularity real quickly, but then they make a lot of strategic errors and can actually die out real quickly. I feel very ambivalent because I think Muharrem Ince has that. So on the one hand, he's an entertainer. He's an energetic campaigner. He can sort of electrify at least his own base. He has a lot of stamina, especially when it comes to campaign. And every now and then, I think he has he has really made his name become known. So I give him that. So there are certain reasons why Muharrem Ince is still around. But on the other hand, Muharrem Ince is a loose cannon. You can never really predict what he's going to say. Sometimes he says things that I think increases appeal. Other times he says things that really, really make him shoot himself in the foot and really hurt his chances. He's not known to be a team player. He's been at high level of opposition politics for more than 10 years now. I think the first time that he ran for CHP leadership against Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was 2014. It's been a decade since he's been trying to become a leader of CHP, and yet I can't count 5 people, 5 politicians, or 5 experts, or 5 technocrats who's been with him. Whom I can say, okay, if this guy wins, these people are going to be his ministers, his cabinet ministers, or these people will be his advisors. So he has failed to really put together an effective team. He has really failed to put together an effective campaign platform. And these are major problems when you're running for high office, especially in a country like Turkey, especially now that you're outside of CHP, trying to sort of unseat not only AKP, but also you're trying to unseat the main opposition party. Having said that, what's the deal with Muharrem Ince? Why has he now caught fire? Well, he caught fire because I think there are a sufficient number of disaffected voters who are pissed off at the fact that the opposition, after 1.5 years of negotiations, nominated Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, an unenergetic, uncharismatic politician who has made several major mistakes over the years. The guy actually even failed to vote in the 2010 referendum, for crying out loud. So, if you're a CHP voter, if you're an Iyi Party voter, there are reasons why you'd be unhappy with the Kılıçdaroğlu choice. So I think Muharrem Ince is really trying to sort of appeal to them. And with this dance that you referred to in your question, he's now trying to appeal to the TikTok generation, for lack of a better term, Let me say it. Let me use that phrase. So there are a lot of very young voters who have no idea what's going on and who are sort of excited about this candidate who seems to be challenging everything. It's sort of like an interesting, watching an interesting show. Looking at some opinion polls, I heard that Muharrem Ince is now getting 5 or 6 percentage points, which is really worrisome for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, because if Ince can maintain this pace, then elections will certainly advance to the second round, because we now have several other candidates who are running, and they will also muster some support. And so when you combine them, it will probably come close to 10%, even if HDP doesn't run. Doesn't nominate a separate candidate. So it could be bad news. I think Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is trying to sort of wait patiently until Muharrem Ince shoots himself in the foot. Fights with a journalist, says something real stupid, or when the opinion polls come out and it looks like, for instance, Tayyip Erdoğan is getting 41%, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is getting 43%, and Muharrem Ince is getting 6%. Kılıçdaroğlu's hope would be that his supporters can then pressure Ince to get out of the way. Now, in order for Ince to survive, I think he needs to be really disciplined. He needs to really have an exit strategy, right? What is he running on? Because he's saying he's running against Tayyip Erdoğan, he's going to advance to the second round. That's not a realistic scenario. He has to be able to tell his supporters, look, I'm running for a cause. The real job is to unseat Erdoğan, but I'm unhappy with Kılıçdaroğlu. I'm unhappy with the deal that he forged with former Islamist politicians. Support me so that I can have a higher bargaining position, and then maybe I can get a better deal. Maybe become a cabinet minister, maybe lower the positions given to these former Islamist parties. I don't know. He has to have a concrete game plan, an exit strategy, and a platform, which he doesn't, which is why I'm really ambivalent. I mean, he has the energy and stamina to run the campaign, but whether his supporters will follow him until election day is a big question mark. If there were, for instance, if HDP were to nominate a candidate itself, it would have been great news for Muharrem Ince. Then you could say, look, elections are advancing to the second round anyway, support me because Kılıçdaroğlu is a bad candidate. But if HDP does not nominate someone, then I think they won't, then that argument won't be solid. So does he have the discipline to really follow through with a plan? I doubt it, which is why I'm really ambivalent. I can't rule him out completely, but I don't give him high chances of making a good deal with Kılıçdaroğlu. So we'll see.
Good dancer. We'll just leave it there.
He's a good dancer. The better dancer than I am.
Hard transition to refugees. Kılıçdaroğlu was at the border last week, March 14th, saying he would return Syrians if elected. He didn't specify how many, as far as I understand, which is a big issue considering there's more than 3.5 million in Turkey. So refugees were a top issue in Turkey before coronavirus. Then it became more and more it became the economy and then the earthquake. Refugees seem to still be one of the top issues, but where would you say the refugee factor is in voters' political calculations? When they're going to the ballot box, does returning refugees really matter to the average Turkish voter? And what do you say about that?
Well, when it comes to the refugee question, Turkey is really an exceptional case, because I think Turkey for some time now is the top refugee hosting country in the world. These Syrian migrants are not officially given refugee status in the Turkish context, but of course they're refugees as far as international law is concerned. And of course, in other countries where you have even lower number of refugees, there is a very strong anti-refugee sentiment. And we haven't necessarily seen that to the same extent. I mean, I know that there is an anti-refugee sentiment and there's some candidates who are not pushing for this position. But you know, compared to even many Western countries, I think that issue has not really come to the forefront as much as some people feared. You know, Turkey is an exceptional case because you have a right-wing populist party with an Islamist agenda that has followed not so much an open door policy when it comes to the Syrian migrants, but at least that has been willingly, for whatever reason, and I think there are many reasons for this, hosting refugees. And I think AKP, because the government controls much of the national media, because the national media cannot really run anti-refugee stories for fear of retribution by the government, this issue is there. I think if you were to take a poll across the country, an overwhelming majority of Turkish voters will say, let's return the refugees back to Syria. But the issue doesn't become an electoral item. It doesn't really become a major issue on the campaign trail. Of course, you know, Kılıçdaroğlu did window dressing. He's been saying this, by the way, for over a year now. So it's not really the first time that he said it. I think he has already said it numerous times that they will return in 2 years' time a certain number of refugees. He hasn't really given a number. And I don't know if that is really feasible. But it's going to run on that, but it's not going to become a top issue. That's why, for instance, Ümit Özdağ's candidacy hasn't really caught fire because I don't think that this issue will become a major electoral issue in this cycle. I think it's in the post-Erdogan Turkey, it will become a decisive issue because once Erdogan is defeated, hopefully this election, but you know, at some point that period will be over, and then whichever government comes to power has to deal with the fact that it will not be able to control the national media. The media will begin to run these anti-refugee stories, and then people will say, okay, well, you know, we've been wishing for the return of refugees for years now. You came to power, you promised, and now deliver. And probably the incoming government will not be able to deliver the promise, because how can you return 3 million, 4 million refugees? It's just not feasible. I think something needs to be done. There's no question about that. I think some people should be given easier access to go to Europe. Others will probably be returned to Syria, and others will need to be integrated to the Turkish society. But these are all complicated plans that would take a while. And I don't think that a post-Erdogan government will be able to effectively resolve this issue in a year time. And then I think this will be a political opening for figures like Ümit Özdağ. So I'm not really worried about the refugee question in the upcoming electoral cycle. I think this will be the issue in the post-Erdogan Turkey. If this makes sense. You know, not in this cycle. I don't think that, in other words, I don't think that people will decide which party to vote on the basis of the refugee question. Let me put it that way.
Great. Yeah, so we need to talk about the economy. In, you know, political science, or observers of international news would conclude that Erdogan would lose simply because of the economic condition of Turkey and the loss of purchasing power, the decline of the lira. These are not favorable circumstances for any government in power in any country, but it does look like Erdogan has a good chance at winning. Can you explain this divergence, this difference? What would you say to people that say, how is Erdogan still appealing to his voters after so many years of economic pain, and the recent actions that he's taken, like raising the minimum wage or proposing, I don't think they passed it, proposing to lower the retirement age? Are these last minute campaign incentives, programs enough to get Erdogan, you know, a new face regarding his economic past? How do you explain it to people? Why is Erdogan still have a chance despite the economy in Turkey?
I think there's several reasons why Erdogan still has a chance. I don't know if it's a very high chance at this point, but he certainly has a winning path. There are several reasons for that. I think it really should be addressed. Part of the reason is because Turkey has an authoritarian regime. First of all, there's an uneven playing field between the ruling party and the opposition. The opposition parties cannot campaign freely. Much of the national media is controlled by Erdogan. So basically, there may be an economic crisis, but if the media is not really very critical of the government, its incompetence in managing the economy, then of course, you don't really get the same kind of popular backlash that you would under a democratic context. I think that needs to be definitely mentioned. And even then, I think we've seen some level of economic voting. Even as late as 2018 presidential elections, Erdogan got 52% of the vote share. His ruling bloc got close to 50% in the parliamentary elections, and now it seems that Erdogan's support is now down to low 40s, according to some optimistic polling results for Erdogan. It might be lower. So he has already lost more than 10 percentage points. Now, looking at the economic mess, you would think that he would have lost more, but considering the authoritarian dynamics of the Turkish political system, the heavy government control of the national media, the fact that much of the state bureaucracy campaigns on behalf of Erdogan, and that Erdogan has name recognition, and the opposition leaders have been partly, this goes back to my criticisms against Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, not necessarily seen to be very effective, competent politicians. He could overcome some of this criticism. Now, in terms of concrete policies, I think you're right. Some of these policies are popular, and he did lower the retirement age, so it passed the parliament, but not yet, I think, not yet gone into effect. But, he's been raising the minimum wage. Today, he promised appointing 45,000 teachers. He's been increasing the number of civil servants on government payroll, right? So, these are all jobs, old-style clientelistic policies that benefit the government base. And of course, you only need the support of 50% of the electorate, maybe not even that under an authoritarian context. And of course, AKP for a very long time has been in power and distribute resources both at the national level and at the local level. They cannot do it since 2019 local elections, but until 2019, right? So, he distributes resources in a partisan way, authoritarian regime, and then some of these perks. For instance, the economic crisis, of course, hurting everyone. Not everyone, but hurting most people in the country. But Erdogan can offset the negative impact of the crisis by increasing the minimum wage, which benefits his base, but hurts the hurts the middle classes, which are not necessarily his base. Many people are homeowners in the country, and home prices are increasing. The inflation, for instance, is making it easier for people who have borrowed money from the banks to pay back their loans. And of course, if you are, under debt, that might be good news, right? So I think even though the crisis hurts everyone, Erdogan has figured out certain ways to offset the negative impact for his own voters. It may not be enough because economic crisis has been going on for a very long time. You can only offset the negative effect for so long. The inflation is really high, which is a problem for Erdogan. And of course, his party is no longer in power at the local level in major cities. And these are the cities where you have increasing number of voters. And of course, if they are casting their ballots for the opposition, it's going to be an uphill battle for Erdogan. But considering the mess that his government has created, I think he has done, from a political point of view, not so much good governance point of view, but from an electoral point of view, who has done wonders in, I think, retaining his base. Most other politicians, I think their careers would have been over by now. So I think we need to take him seriously in the upcoming election.
Yeah, and you've written extensively on the AKP patronage networks and how certain companies and employers and employees depend on the AKP to remain in power. Would you say that's part of the reason why Erdogan retains, high likelihood of re-election?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think one point that we've seen after this devastating earthquake was how quickly the buildings crumbled. Well, that happened because, of course, AKP created this almost a Ponzi scheme within Turkey's construction sector. You have freely available public land which gets distributed to contractors, mostly affiliated with AKP. Then those contractors come in, construct these high-rise apartments within the city center of Anatolian provinces, make huge profits. Some of it go back to AKP politicians as bribes. And of course, homeowners now have the chance to buy cheap apartments. Well, the Ponzi scheme collapsed after the earthquake, but it was thanks to this Ponzi scheme that I think over the last 20 years, AKP created a middle class, a sizable middle class across Anatolian provinces. I mean, most people manage to own apartments thanks to these policies. Now, it's a short-sighted policy. It's a very dangerous one, as we've seen in the earthquake zone. But if you're a lower middle class voter, who purchased his or her apartment for the first time, that's a big step. And, then you feel indebted to Erdogan for a very long time. I think AKP benefited from that exploitation of public land, freely available public land. But it seems to be over. I think it's not just Erdogan and AKP who runs the risk of losing the election, but I think the whole governing model of AKP runs the risk of collapsing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have a question on smaller parties, and I think we can group this with another question about TIP that I received. Basically, TIP, the leftist party, Turkish Workers' Party, might run its own list of candidates. Today, it seems Fatih Erbakan announced his candidacy. That's the new Refugee party, right? Welfare party. What should observers make of these smaller parties and coalitions? There's also a third alliance of leftist parties. How would you explain it to outside observers, and what's important to note regarding the smaller parties and where their support goes?
Well, here the irony is that when Erdogan pushed for this hyper-presidential system in 2017, one of the main arguments that were made by him and the AKP politicians was that this new system would end the risk of coalition governments and that would have a very stable, strong government sort of coming to place. And I think this is how Erdogan thought would happen, in a two-round electoral system where you need 50% support in order to win the elections. The expectation is, of course, the bigger party would have a huge advantage because, of course, the smaller parties would not necessarily have the chance to advance to the second round. So that's probably either in the first round or the second round, as we've been discussing with Ince, when you have high polarization, the support base of these smaller parties would evaporate. Ironically, we're now witnessing the opposite scenario, where both within the ruling camp as well as the opposition camp, minor parties are emerging, are increasing their bargaining position, and really negotiating heavily with these parties. The Welfare Again Party with AKP, TIP with HDP, the minor right-wing Islamist splinter parties with CHP, because, of course, in a tight race, even if the society is polarized, you just need those additional 2 seats to win parliamentary majority, or that you may need those additional 1 or 2 percentage points to win the presidential election. I think that's what we're seeing. I think another point that we're seeing, and this is really bad news for Erdogan, I would say this is now a speculation. I think we need to see how he proceeds in the campaign. But the fact that Fatih Erbakan refused to bandwagon with Erdogan is a very good signal that Erdogan is not a shoe-in to win this election, that he's not the clear favorite, and that probably Erbakan thought him joining Erdogan was not going to be a bandwagoning. That's I think a very positive signal, but a very optimistic signal for the opposition. I think TİP, maybe even Muharrem İnce, certainly Erbakan, the Welfare Again Party, these minor parties are now, making long-term plans in a post-Erdogan Turkey. And so that's why they wanna contest the elections under their party banner, get more than 3% of the vote share. 3% is critical because if you cross the 3% barrier, you get state donations. You're publicly financed from the state treasury. That gives you money to campaign better in the next election cycle. If you join the party, and TİP is now heavily negotiating so that it can have more MPs in the next parliament, so that provided that Erdogan will lose the presidential election, they'll be able to campaign even more effectively under a democratic Turkey. So I think they're all getting greedy. And I'm not necessarily saying this in a negative sort of critical way. I think they're all really motivated, energized that Turkish politics, which had been frozen for the last 20 years, more or less parties getting the same amount of support, no new parties on the rise, is beginning to unfreeze. And we've already seen it in the last 3 years. These splinter parties that split from AKP, Turkish Labour Party emerging, now Fatih Erbakan, Muharrem İnce, they're all hoping that they'll get a bigger piece of the pie, of the cake in the post-Erdogan Turkey. And so that's why they're trying to get a better bargain. Sometimes the bargaining collapses, as it happened with Fatih Erbakan and AKP negotiation. Probably Erbakan wanted more than what AKP could give to them. I think a similar outcome may occur between HDP and Turkish Workers' Party, because I think Turkish Workers' Party is really hopeful about its prospects after the earthquake. They've been very visible. So they're probably asking way more than their vote share should allow them to get from HDP. And that negotiation may collapse, and that Turkish Workers' Party will probably contest the elections under its own party list. And I think it's going to be very interesting. Post-2023 politics will be, I think, very interesting. You might see some surprises.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, normally you see splintering of leftist parties. Now we're seeing splintering of the right as well. To start wrapping up, we have 2 more questions, and we have to talk about election integrity, security of ballot boxes. We've seen gunfights in Urfa, I think, every time there's an election. There's soldiers at some ballot boxes that can be aggressive, according to reports from previous elections. And some people have claimed to be forced to vote openly to show who they're voting for in certain parts of the country. I'm not saying this is widespread practice, but there have been reports of problems. So what would you say to watch out for, and how secure is Turkish ballots and voting process?
Well, I can probably only offer a qualified response to this question, because historically speaking, actually electoral integrity was probably the best thing that Turkish democracy could deliver. On civil liberties, human rights, Turkish democracy always underperformed. And when it came to electoral integrity, Turkey outperformed many of its counterparts in the global south, which is why Turkey generally has a history of clean elections. I would say generally, because of course, especially since 2015, I think Turkey no longer has a democratic regime, and of course, because of the existence of this autocratization process, ballot boxes are not secure. And I think we have seen over the years some electoral irregularities. Think of the unstamped ballot box scandal in 2017 referendum, the violence, like you suggested, not just in Urfa, but I think across Southeast between June and November 2015, when EKP lost its parliamentary majority and then regained it. And then, of course, Kayyum politics, the repeat elections in Istanbul after 2019 local elections when AKP candidate lost. So we're beginning to see some level of electoral irregularities. And I can't rule it out in this election. Most likely it will happen. The question is the extent of the irregularities, because, Turkey is a country with nearly 85 million people. Probably we're going to have, I have to check the full figure, but probably approximately 60 million voters. Stealing even 1 percentage points would require 600,000 votes to be, shifted around. That's not easy to do. So I'm not expecting a Belarus-style voter fraud where 10 percentage points shift. But we'll probably see some intervention in the margins. So I think it partly comes down to how effective opposition parties are in keeping the ballot boxes safe. They've been, the opposition alliance has been telling us that they are going to do a good job. I have no way of verifying that. We'll only see it on election day. As I already mentioned, I'm really worried about HDP not contesting the elections and what it may mean for heavily Kurdish populated provinces where you only have AKP and the Kurdish political movement as the only viable political actors. I'm a bit unsure and skeptical about the situation in the earthquake zone because, not just Hatay, but some of these other provinces badly affected by the earthquake, they're 30%, 40% deserted. So where are we going to have the election take place physically? Whether or not opposition parties will have the organization capacity to oversee the process, because of course, opposition campaigners also lost their lives. Some party workers are no longer working. The ruling party does not face that risk because the ruling party has the support of civil servants. Opposition parties need to come up with observers. And so I don't know how the situation will be in the earthquake affected region. Another point that I have no idea is what will happen to these people who left the earthquake zone. We know that there are more than 2 million people who moved out of the earthquake zone to live with their friends and relatives across the country. Now, not all of them are voters, but probably 1.5 million of them are voters. Now, according to the most recent figure shared by the government, only 340,000 of them re-registered themselves under their new addresses. So that either means quite a sizable portion of these people will move back to the earthquake zone in 7 weeks' time. I don't find it to be a very realistic scenario, or they won't vote. Well, if they don't vote, the voter participation goes down, and we might see really some unbalanced political results in the earthquake zone, where a city like Hatay, where you have strong CHP bastions in some districts, a sizable Arab Alawi minority casting their ballots for leftist parties, particularly CHP. That province is mostly deserted, especially CHP strongholds. So we might end up with a heavily AKP-dominated Hatay, unless this issue is resolved. I'm not predicting this will happen, but there is a risk of that because you have a lot of public authorities, NGO workers from Islamist NGOs who move to Hatay, and also some municipality workers to provide services. If AKP gets higher level of support from them, we might see unbalanced results. So I think the earthquake changed the electoral dynamics a bit. It worries me. Doesn't mean that the government will be able to steal a lot of votes, but we need, I think the opposition needs to win with a comfortable margin. So more than 1 percentage point in order to make sure that no sketchy thing will happen on election night.
Great. And last question, what happens if Erdogan loses? Do you see a transition to power going over smoothly? Will he step down, basically, is the question. Will Erdogan step down if he loses? Are we going to see something like January 6th in the US or the attack on Brasilia in Brazil? Anything that you can say regarding what to watch out for, what to expect? Do you see signs of organization for post-election scenarios? What would you advise to keep an eye on?
Well, I mean, this is certainly a speculation at this point. Like I said, I'm not expecting massive fraud, and thus I'm not expecting Erdogan to go Lukashenko, basically steal an election that he had lost outright and somehow try to stay in power. He could try to, if it turns out that the margin is really close, he may try to engage in some level of fraud, some level of voter irregularities, and then get congratulatory phone calls from Beijing, from Moscow, and basically try to do a fait accompli, say, I won, and then, let the opposition suffer. If the margin of victory for the opposition is really low, this is a scenario. And then it comes down to basically the decision of the opposition to contest the results. If they do, will people go out on the street? The one thing that worries me about Kılıçdaroğlu candidacy is that, he's old, he's not very energetic. Unlike İmamoğlu, over the years, he has not necessarily directly confronted the ruling party on the streets, if necessary. And so, that's something to follow, the margin of victory for whichever side, and then the opposition's response. If Erdogan tries to pull off a major fraud case, again, I find it not that likely, then of course the person to follow is Hulusi Akar. Because as you know from Venezuela, as you know from Belarus, some other cases, if you're going to steal an election, you need to have the security apparatus lined up behind you. Most likely the police forces will be very pro-government. The military might be sitting on the fence. The Turkish military has never really done something like that. So Akar's position that might, I hope it doesn't come down to that, but if we are talking about scenario speculations, I think that's something to consider. However, at the end of the day, I think Erdogan will probably not engage in such an outrageous move, because some people suggest that if he loses everything, and then he may get prosecuted. I don't buy that. I don't think that it's going to be that easy to prosecute Erdogan, even if he loses. If he loses, he can say, look, you accuse me of being an autocratic leader. I'm handing back power. These opposition parties are incompetent. They won't be able to govern the country. I'm going to come back in 2 years. And in the meantime, who's going to prosecute Erdogan? His henchmen can get prosecuted, but not Erdogan is popular. Even in the US case, look at how difficult it's been to prosecute Trump. And you need 400 MPs to open up an investigation. So it's not so Erdogan need not engage in that nuclear scenario, nuclear option. But opposition needs to be very vigilant. Opposition needs to be very, its eyes need to be on the ball. Protect the ballot boxes, count the votes, disseminate the accurate results to the voters, and then sort of keep the pressure on Erdogan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always remember the pictures of people sleeping on ballots.
Yes,
during the Istanbul recount. So democracy is not taken lightly. People will defend it, and it's hard to pull off something crazy. It's a positive note to end on, which I wasn't expecting. Thank you everyone for joining. Berk, did you want to say anything else? Feeling good?
No, these were excellent questions. I think we covered it all.
Covered it all, which is hard to do, but it took an hour and a half, so maybe that's why. So everybody, thank you for joining us. Have a good evening, and let's see what the elections have in store for us. Bye. See you.
Bye.